The morning the Americans came, Katarzyna was scrubbing blood from floorboards that had held blood before, would hold blood again. Her hands moved in circles that had become muscle memory. The brush worn down to nubs, splinters embedded beneath her fingernails like tiny monuments to survival. The water in her bucket had long since turned the color of rust, and the smell of lye soap mixed with something fouler. Something that 18 months in this place had taught her couldn't be scrubbed away no matter how hard she worked. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She was 23 years old. She looked 40. The building shook. Not like the other times. Not the rhythmic shuddering of the machines in the munitions factory across the compound. Not the distant percussion of Allied bombs that had been growing closer for weeks. This was different. Sharp. Immediate. The crack of rifle fire, close enough that Katarzyna could hear the ejection of shell casings hitting concrete. "Get down!" someone hissed. Marta. Always Marta, the Polish nurse who'd been taken from Krakow in '43, who still somehow maintained a thread of authority in her voice despite everything they'd done to break it. Katarzyna dropped the brush. It clattered against the bucket's edge, a small sound that seemed enormous in the sudden silence that followed. She pressed herself against the wall, feeling the cold seep through her thin dress. The dress that was standard issue, pale blue cotton that buttoned down the front for ease of access, for efficiency. They'd learned to think in terms of efficiency here. It was how you survived. Through the window, the one small window that faced east, toward the main gates, she could see figures moving. Not the gray-green of Wehrmacht uniforms or the black of SS. These were different. Olive drab. Moving with purpose but also with a kind of cautious humanity she'd almost forgotten existed. One of them kicked open a door across the courtyard. Another was shouting in English words that carried but didn't translate, not yet. "Americans," breathed Sophia from the corner. Beautiful Sophia, who'd been a dancer in Prague, who still sometimes moved her fingers as if tracing invisible choreography across invisible stages. "They're actually here." Katarzyna's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might crack a rib. For 18 months they'd heard rumors. Whispered exchanges in the laundry lines, coded messages in the way the guards shifted their weight when news came down from command. The Allies were advancing. The Russians from the east, the British and Americans from the west. Germany was being crushed between two massive fists, and everyone in this camp, guards and captives alike, had been holding their breath, waiting to see which fist would reach them first. The door to their building exploded inward. Not kicked, blown. The concussion knocked Katarzyna backward, and she landed hard on her tailbone, spots swimming in her vision. When they cleared, she saw him. An American soldier, maybe 19 years old, with a rifle raised and eyes that went wide with something that looked like horror. He lowered his weapon slowly. Behind him, 2 more soldiers entered, and then a sergeant, older, harder-faced, but with that same expression trying to crack through trained composure. "Jesus Christ," the sergeant said. His voice was rough, Midwestern accent coding words that Katarzyna understood because her father had taught her English when she was small, when the world was still a place where knowing languages meant opportunity, not just survival. "How many are in here?" 15, Marta answered. She'd pulled herself upright, standing with her shoulders back despite the bruises that mottled her collarbone. Despite the way her lip was split from yesterday's altercation with Officer Hartmann. 15 women, mostly Polish, some Czech, 1 Hungarian. The young soldier was staring at them with an expression Katarzyna couldn't quite parse. It wasn't pity or not just pity. It was shock. Profound, nauseating shock. The kind that comes when reality doesn't match what you'd been prepared for, no matter how many briefings you'd attended about what the camps contained. "Are you?" He started, then stopped. Started again. "Are you prisoners of war?" Laughter bubbled up in Katarzyna's throat, inappropriate and slightly hysterical. Prisoners of war. The phrase was so clean, so official. It implied battles, opposing armies, the rules of Geneva Conventions. "No," Marta said flatly. "We are comfort women." The sergeant's jaw tightened. He turned to the young soldier. "Get medics. Now. And tell command we need female personnel here, immediately. No men, understand? Only women." The soldier ran. Katarzyna watched him go, watched the way his boots kicked up dust that caught the morning light streaming through the broken door. The light looked different today. Sharper. More real. For 18 months, light had been rationed like everything else. Filtered through dirty glass, controlled by electric switches operated by German guards who decided when they deserved to see, when darkness was more appropriate for the work they did. "You're free," the sergeant said. He was looking at them, really looking, trying to see them as human beings instead of the hollow-eyed ghosts they'd become. "The camp is liberated. You're under American protection now. Free." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that reached every corner where women were slowly emerging from hiding places they'd instinctively sought when the shooting started. Katarzyna felt the word hit her chest, felt it bounce off, unable to penetrate. Sophia started crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that carved clean paths through the grime on her face. Anna, the Hungarian girl who was only 17, began to shake so violently that her teeth chattered. Sophia, who'd stopped speaking 3 months ago after Officer Schmidt had, Katarzyna shut down that thought. She'd gotten good at that, shutting down thoughts before they could fully form, before they could drag her back into memories that would shatter the careful numbness she'd constructed around herself like armor. "We need to document this," another voice said. A woman's voice. Katarzyna looked up to see a Red Cross nurse entering, American accent, face already schooling itself into professional neutrality, even as her eyes told a different story. Behind her, 2 more nurses, a chaplain, and a man with a camera who took one look at the interior of the building and went pale. "No pictures," Marta said sharply. "Not of them. Not like this." The photographer nodded quickly, lowering his camera. "I understand. Just the facilities. For evidence. Evidence." Another clean, official word that couldn't possibly contain what this place had been. The Red Cross nurse, her name tag read Morrison, knelt beside Katarzyna. "Can you tell me your name?" "Katarzyna Nowak." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Speaking her full name felt like reclaiming something she'd thought lost. For 18 months, she'd been number 7. Or sometimes just the Polish one. Or, more often, nothing at all, just a body that fulfilled a function. "Katarzyna," Nurse Morrison repeated, and the care she took with the pronunciation made something crack in Katarzyna's chest. "Can you stand? We need to get all of you out of here. Get you medical attention, proper food." "We can stand," Marta interrupted. "We've been standing for 18 months. We can stand now." And they did. One by one, the 15 women pulled themselves upright. Some leaned on walls on each other. Sophia's legs were shaking. Anna looked like she might collapse. But they stood. Katarzyna had been a teacher. This fact seemed almost absurd now, but it was true. She taught English and literature at a gymnasium in Poznan, had spent her mornings conjugating verbs with 14-year-olds who complained about homework, had spent her evenings grading essays about Mikovic and Slowakia, drinking tea that her mother brewed too strong, planning lessons for the following week. That was the life before. Before September 1939. Before the German invasion that had shattered Poland like glass under a hammer. Before her father had been shot in the street for the crime of being an intellectual. Before her mother had died of pneumonia in the winter of 41 because there was no medicine, no heat, no reason for the occupiers to care whether Polish civilians lived or died. The gymnasium had been converted into a Wehrmacht administrative building. Katarzyna had gone from teacher to factory worker overnight. First in a textile mill, then, when her English was discovered, as a translator in the labor office. That's what she'd been doing in August 1943 when the SS had come through, conducting one of their selections. She remembered the officer who'd looked at her papers. Hopsturmfer Coke, pale eyes like ice chips, hands that didn't shake when he stamped documents that determined fates. He'd studied her photograph, then her face, then her papers again. 22 years old, unmarried, no children, university educated. He'd said it in German, expecting her to understand. She did. "You speak English?" "Yes." Her voice had been steady then. She'd still believed that cooperation, politeness, making herself useful, that these things might protect her. "And French?" "Some." My Russian is better. Coke had smiled. Not warmly. The smile of a man who'd found exactly what he was looking for. You'll come with us. She'd thought. God help her, she'd actually thought that she was being selected for translation work. Something administrative. Maybe even something that would get her better rations, marginally safer conditions. The war couldn't last forever. Everyone said that. You just had to survive until it ended. The truck had taken her and 9 other women, all young, all unmarried, all deemed sufficiently attractive by whatever metric the SS used for such selections, to a processing center 30 kilometers outside Poznan. They'd been stripped, examined by a doctor who'd looked at them with the clinical detachment of someone inspecting livestock. They'd been given the blue dresses. They'd been assigned numbers. You will serve the Reich, a female officer had told them, her Polish heavily accented but clear. You will provide comfort and companionship to German officers and soldiers who are fighting for the future of Europe. You will be housed, fed, and medically supervised. You will follow all rules. Attempts to escape will result in execution. Attempts to harm German personnel will result in execution. Pregnancy will result in termination and possible execution. Do you understand? Katarzyna had understood, but she hadn't believed. Not really. Not until the first night, when an officer whose name she never learned had entered her room. A small cell with a bed, a basin, nothing else, and begun unbuttoning his uniform with the casual efficiency of someone performing a routine task. Please, she'd said in German. Please, I'm not. I don't. He'd struck her. Not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough to split her lip, to make her understand that words wouldn't save her. Nothing would save her. This was what she was now. This was what she would be until the war ended or she died, whichever came first. Marta had found her afterward, had brought wet cloth to clean the blood, had held her while she shook. You survived, Marta had whispered. That's all we do now. We survive. 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute at a time. We survive. And they had. Through the autumn of 1943, through the winter that killed 2 of their number, 1 to typhus, 1 to suicide by belt in the shower room. Through the spring of 1944, when the Eastern Front began to collapse and the officers who visited them grew rougher, more desperate, taking out their fear and fury on bodies that couldn't fight back. Sophia had arrived in January, transferred from another facility that had been too close to the advancing Russian lines. She told them stories about the Eastern camps, about women who'd been worked to death in the camps alongside the Jewish prisoners, about medical experiments, about horrors that made even their own situation seem almost bearable by comparison. At least they feed us, Sophia had said bitterly. At least they keep us clean enough to use again. The camp they were in now, Lagernord, though no one official had ever told them its name, had been established in early 1944 as an auxiliary facility to the main concentration camp 10 kilometers south. It housed a munitions factory, a vehicle repair depot, and several administrative buildings. And it housed them. The comfort women who serviced officers, who were kept separate from the main prisoner population, who existed in a strange liminal space between slave and person. They had a schedule. That was the most surreal part, the rigid schedule that governed their degradation. Wake at 6. Washington eat a breakfast of dark bread and ersatz coffee. Medical inspection every Wednesday. Officers could book time in 15-minute or 30-minute blocks, scheduled through an adjutant who maintained a ledger like they were resources to be allocated. Evening meal at 7. Lights out at 10, unless an officer had booked late hours. Katarzyna had learned to divide herself. There was the body that performed functions, that did what was required, that had learned to shut down sensation and response. And there was the self, the real self, that retreated deep inside, that held onto memories of teaching, of her mother's tea, of the taste of real butter on fresh bread, of walking through Poznan on autumn evenings when the leaves turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and possibility. That self was very small now, very quiet, but it was still there, and as long as it remained, she wasn't entirely broken. Anna, the Hungarian girl, hadn't learned to divide herself yet. She still cried, still begged, still looked at each man who entered her room with desperate hope that maybe this one would be different, would be kind, would remember that she was human. Katarzyna wanted to tell her to stop hoping, that hope was more dangerous than despair, but she couldn't find the words that wouldn't sound like cruelty. Zofia, who'd stopped speaking, had learned the opposite lesson. She'd divided herself so completely that Katarzyna sometimes wondered if the real Zofia was still in there at all, or if only the body remained, moving through the motions like a machine that had forgotten it once had a soul. The worst had been Officer Hartmann. Always Hartmann, with his particular tastes, his enjoyment of fear. He'd been the one who'd split Marta's lip yesterday, who'd broken Anna's finger last month, who seemed to derive some special pleasure from their pain. The other officers mostly wanted efficiency, quick relief, minimal interaction. But Hartmann wanted to hurt, wanted to see them flinch, wanted to prove over and over that they were nothing. When the Allied bombs had started falling close enough to shake the buildings, Hartmann had grown worse, more violent, more erratic, as if the coming defeat of Germany needed to be taken out on someone, and they were there, available, powerless. 3 days ago, he'd told Katarzyna that when the Russians came, because it would be the Russians, he'd said, not the Americans, the Russians didn't make it this far west. They'd kill all the comfort women to erase the evidence. You think liberation will save you? He'd laughed. You're all dead anyway, this way or that way. She'd believed him. They'd all believed him. That's why, when the shooting started this morning, they'd hidden. They'd thought the Germans were executing them before retreat. It had seemed more probable than rescue. But it was Americans who'd come through that door. Americans who looked at them with shock and pity instead of ownership. Americans who used words like free and protection and evidence, as if those words could possibly describe what happened next. The Americans set up a temporary medical station in what had been the camp commandant's office. It was the cleanest building in the compound, with real windows that weren't broken, a floor that had been recently swept, a desk made of actual wood instead of the metal tables they'd been examined on every Wednesday for 18 months. Nurse Morrison worked with quiet efficiency, cataloging injuries that couldn't all be seen. Physical damage was easier, the bruises, the malnutrition evident in protruding ribs and hollow cheeks, the infections, the scars. But Katarzyna could see Morrison struggling with what to write when a woman flinched at gentle touch, when eyes went blank during examination, when someone started shaking for no visible reason. We're going to get you all to a proper hospital, Morrison said. She was speaking slowly, carefully, the way you'd speak to someone who might not understand. But her eyes, Katarzyna appreciated that her eyes treated them like adults who'd survived something, not children who needed coddling. We have facilities about 50 kilometers west. Clean beds, hot water, real food, medical care, counselors. Counselors? Marta's voice held skepticism learned through brutal experience. What are they going to counsel? How to forget? How to pretend this didn't happen? Morrison paused in her note-taking. No. How to live with the fact that it did. The honesty was almost shocking. Katarzyna had expected platitudes, false cheer, the kind of toxic optimism that treated trauma like a problem that could be solved with enough positive thinking. But Morrison's bluntness felt more respectful somehow. An acknowledgement that some things couldn't be fixed, only endured. Outside, they could hear more soldiers moving through the camp. The main concentration camp facility had been liberated 3,000 prisoners, the sergeant had said, most of them barely alive. The Americans were overwhelmed, understaffed, trying to process an atrocity too large to fully comprehend. The sound of retching carried through the window as soldiers saw the reality of the camps for the first time, saw what their textbooks and briefings had failed to adequately prepare them for. Zofia was being examined when she suddenly grabbed Morrison's wrist. The others, she said urgently. The women in the main camp, there are others there too. Women who were like us, but worse. There with the regular prisoners. Morrison's expression tightened. I'll make sure they're found. I promise. Don't promise, Zofia said bitterly. Just do it. The chaplain, a Catholic priest named Father Murphy who seemed deeply uncomfortable but determined to help, was moving among them, offering water, crackers, words that fell flat because what prayers existed for this? Katarzyna accepted water but waved away the crackers. Her stomach had shrunk over months of inadequate rations. Too much food too fast would just come back up. Anna was sitting in the corner, still shaking. The young soldier who'd first entered their building. He'd come back, was hovering awkwardly nearby, clearly wanting to help but having no idea how. He'd brought his canteen, was offering it to her with the earnestness of someone who'd grown up believing America was the hero of every story. "What's your name?" he asked Anna gently. She stared at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Does it matter?" "Yes," he said with surprising firmness. "It matters. You matter." Anna started crying again. He looked panicked, turned to Nurse Morrison with silent plea for guidance. Morrison just shook her head slightly. "Let her cry," the gesture said. Crying meant something inside hadn't died completely. The sergeant, his name was Reynolds, Katarzyna had learned, came back into the building with a clipboard and a grim expression. "We need to take statements," he said, "for the war crimes documentation. I know this is difficult, but we need records, evidence for the tribunals." "You mean you need us to describe it?" Marta said flatly. "In detail, for legal purposes." Reynolds didn't flinch from her anger. "Yes, I'm sorry, but yes. What happened here, what happened to you, it needs to be documented. The people who did this need to be held accountable. The people who did this are probably already fleeing toward Argentina," Sophia muttered, but she straightened her shoulders. "Fine. Where do I start? With the selection? The transport? The first night? The 100th night? Do you want names? Because I can give you names." A female translator had arrived. A Czech woman in American uniform, eyes red-rimmed like she'd already been crying at something else she'd seen today. She sat down with Sophia, began taking notes in careful handwriting that seemed absurdly orderly given what was being described. Katarzyna waited her turn, watching as each woman spoke to the translator, watched as their words were transmuted into English on official forms, watched as their suffering was reduced to terminology like forced prostitution and sexual slavery and crimes against humanity. The words were accurate but inadequate. How did you put 18 months of systematic dehumanization into boxes on a form? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. When it was her turn, she sat down across from the translator. The woman's name tag read Kov, and took a breath that felt like it scraped her lungs. "Name?" Kovar asked gently. "Katarzyna Nowak. Born April 12, 1921, in Poznan, Poland. Taken by the SS in August 1943. Brought here to Lagernord in September 1944. Can you describe the circumstances of your capture?" And so Katarzyna began to speak. She described the selection, the processing center, the assignment to Lagernord. She described the building where they'd been held, the rooms, the schedule. She gave names when she knew them. Officer Hartmann, Hauptsturm für Koch, Commandant Weber who'd run the camp. She described the Wednesday medical inspections, the way they were treated both as prisoners and as a service to be provided to German personnel. Kovar's hand shook slightly as she wrote. "Did you ever attempt to escape?" "Once. In October 1944. They caught me before I reached the outer fence. I was disciplined, publicly, to discourage others." "Can you describe the—" "No," Katarzyna interrupted. Some things didn't need to be memorialized in official documents. Some things could stay buried in the part of her memory she'd already decided never to excavate. "I can't. Not that. I can tell you I survived it. That's enough." Kovar nodded, made a note, moved on. The interview lasted 40 minutes. When it was done, Katarzyna felt scraped hollow, like she'd vomited up 18 months of poison, and now there was nothing left inside her but empty space. By early afternoon, all 15 women had given statements. The medics had finished preliminary examinations. Arrangements had been made for transport to the hospital facility. But there was a problem. Trucks were scarce, needed for evacuating the sickest prisoners from the main camp. They'd have to wait until tomorrow morning. "You'll be safe here tonight," Reynolds assured them. "We have guards posted. No one will harm you." But safe was a word that had lost all meaning. Katarzyna looked around at the building where they'd spent 18 months, at the walls that had witnessed their degradation, At the floors she'd scrubbed that morning without knowing it would be the last time. They were free, technically. The Germans were gone. The Americans were here. But the building remained the same. The memories remained the same. Can we burn it? The question came from Zofia. The first words she'd spoken in 3 months, and they were about fire. Reynolds looked startled. The building. Yes. Zofia's voice was rough from disuse. When we leave tomorrow, can we burn it? Reynolds exchanged glances with Father Murphy, with Nurse Morrison. I don't see why not. It's not like we need it for anything. Yeah, I can arrange that. When you leave tomorrow, we'll burn it down. Something that might have been a smile ghosted across Zofia's face. It was the most animated Katarzyna had seen her in months. That night, their last night in the building, though free this time, with American guards outside instead of German ones. The women gathered in what had been the common room. Someone had found candles. Father Murphy had left bread and cheese, real food, more than they could safely eat but comforting in its abundance. They didn't talk much. Words felt too small for what had happened, what was happening, what would happen next. But Zofia started humming, an old Czech folk song about mountains and home. Anna joined in, her Hungarian lullaby weaving around the melody. Marta added a Polish hymn her grandmother had taught her. Katarzyna listened to the music rising in the candlelight, listened to voices that had been silenced finding sound again. She thought about tomorrow, about hospitals and statements and tribunals. She thought about the building burning, flames consuming the walls that had contained their suffering. But mostly she thought about the word Morrison had used. Live. How to live with the fact that this happened. She didn't know if she could learn that. Didn't know if any of them could. But as the music continued, as the candles burned down, as the last night in hell became the first night of whatever came after, she thought maybe survival was enough for now. Morning came with spring sunlight that felt wrong somehow, too beautiful, too indifferent to human suffering. Katarzyna woke on the floor where she'd fallen asleep, surrounded by the other women who'd clustered together for warmth and safety, despite the Americans' promises of protection. Old habits died hard. Sleeping separately in individual rooms still felt too dangerous, too vulnerable. Nurse Morrison arrived with the sunrise, bringing more food and clean clothes donated from military supplies. The clothes were men's uniforms, too large, but they were clean and didn't button down the front for ease of access. Katarzyna pulled on trousers and a shirt that smelled like detergent and possibility. The blue dress she'd worn for 18 months she left in a crumpled heap on the floor. The trucks are here, Morrison said. We'll get you loaded up in about 20 minutes. But first, Sergeant Reynolds says you wanted something. They walked outside together, all 15 women and a dozen American soldiers, to stand in the courtyard facing the building where they'd been held. Reynolds had jerry cans of gasoline. He looked at them, waiting for confirmation. Do it, Marta said. The soldiers doused the building methodically, walls, floors, the rooms where things had happened that would never be fully erased from memory. When Reynolds struck the match, the flame looked small and insufficient. But then the gasoline caught, and suddenly there was a roar of heat and light that drove them all backward. The building burned. It burned fast and hot, wood and plaster and memory going up in smoke that rose into the indifferent blue sky. Katarzyna watched the windows burst from the heat, watched the roof collapse inward, watched 18 months of systematic horror reduced to ash and ember. Anna started laughing. It was slightly hysterical laughter, edged with something that might have been grief or might have been relief or might have been the simple absurdity of standing free while your prison burned. Zofia joined her, then Marta, then others, until half the women were laughing and half were crying and some were doing both at once. The soldiers watched them with expressions that ranged from confusion to discomfort to deep, aching understanding. These men had liberated camps before, Reynolds had said. They'd seen what the war had done to people. They knew that sometimes laughter and tears were the same language spoken in different dialects. When the fire had reduced the building to smoldering rubble, when there was nothing left but the foundation and the memory of flames, Reynolds turned to them. Ready! The trucks were waiting, 2 of them with canvas covers and wooden benches. Nurse Morrison helped them climb in, handled each woman with a care that seemed to understand that touch was complicated now. that even gentle hands could trigger memories of rough ones. The drive took 3 hours over roads cratered by war. They passed through villages where German civilians watched them with expressions ranging from hostility to studied indifference. They passed burned-out tanks, abandoned positions, signs of a collapsed empire's desperate retreat. The landscape looked tired, like the earth itself was exhausted from bearing witness to so much destruction. The hospital facility turned out to be a commandeered school in a town called Himmelsberg. Ironic name, Heaven's Castle, for a place that was processing the survivors of hell. But it was clean, organized, staffed with competent medical personnel who'd been specially trained for dealing with camp survivors. They were assigned to a women's ward on the 2nd floor. Real beds with clean sheets, windows that opened, a bathroom with actual hot water. Katarzyna stood under the shower for 20 minutes, scrubbing its skin that felt permanently contaminated, watching water circle the drain and wishing her memories could wash away as easily. That first week was a blur of medical examinations, psychological assessments, interviews with more officials collecting more evidence. Doctors treated infections, set Anna's finger properly, prescribed medicines for conditions they didn't name but implied with gentle tact. The food was regular and abundant, though most of them could only eat small amounts before their shrunken stomachs rebelled. At night, they still clustered together. The doctors tried to discourage it, said they needed to relearn independence, personal space, normal sleeping patterns. But normal was a country they could no longer locate on any map. Sleeping alone felt dangerous. Sleeping together felt survivable. Sophia started drawing. One of the nurses had given her paper and pencils, and she filled pages with images that Katarzyna couldn't always look at directly. Abstract shapes that somehow conveyed violence and degradation more effectively than any realistic rendering could have. The drawings piled up on her bedside table, an external archive of internal horror. Marta wrote letters to her sister in Krakow if she was still alive, to the Catholic diocese, asking about her nursing credentials, whether she could work again, to the Polish government in exile in London, asking what would happen to them, where they were supposed to go, what identity existed for women like them in whatever post-war world was being constructed from the rubble. Anna slept, and slept, and slept. The doctors said it was depression, a natural response to prolonged trauma. They gave her pills that Katarzyna wasn't sure helped. Sometimes Anna woke screaming. Sometimes she woke crying so quietly you almost couldn't hear it. Sometimes she woke and stared at the ceiling with eyes that looked ancient and empty. Sophia, who'd spoken those few words about burning the building, retreated into silence again. But it was a different silence now. Less broken, more contemplative. She spent hours by the window, watching spring unfold in the valley below. Trees leafing out, wildflowers blooming, birds building nests in eaves. Life continuing its indifferent cycle. Katarzyna tried to read. The facility had a small library, books in multiple languages salvaged from who knew where. She found a water-damaged copy of Pride and Prejudice in English and tried to lose herself in Austen's world of manners and marriage plots. But the words felt like they were written in a language she'd once known but had forgotten, describing a reality that had never really existed or had existed so long ago it might as well have been mythology. On the 8th day, a woman from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration came to speak with them. She was British, efficient, kind in the way bureaucrats can be when their paperwork involves human suffering. She explained that there were programs being developed, resources being allocated, plans for rehabilitation and resettlement. Many women in your situation are choosing to emigrate, she said carefully. America, Canada, Australia, they're accepting refugees. Or you can return to your home countries if you have families there. We'll help you either way. What about women who don't have families anymore? Marta asked. Women whose families might not want them back? Women whose communities will call them collaborators. The administrator's professional mask slipped slightly. We're working on solutions for those situations as well. Solutions. As if they were mathematical problems to be solved rather than human beings whose entire lives had been shattered and needed rebuilding from fragments. 3 months after liberation, Katarzyna stood in the office of Dr. Helena Bergman, a German-Jewish psychiatrist who'd survived their science debt and now dedicated herself to treating other survivors. The irony of being treated by a German woman wasn't lost on Katarzyna, but Dr. Bergman's own numbers tattooed on her forearm created a strange kinship, a shared vocabulary of survival. "Tell me about the nightmares," Dr. Bergman said. Not asked, said. Direct. No pretense that Katarzyna might not be having them. "They're always the same," Katarzyna answered. "I'm back in the building, but this time I can't get out. The doors are locked, the windows are barred, and I can hear them coming down the hallway. But I can't run. My legs won't work. I just stand there, frozen, knowing what's about to happen. And then I wake up, usually screaming, sometimes just crying. Sometimes I throw up." Dr. Bergman made notes in her careful handwriting. "These are normal responses to abnormal situations. Your mind is processing trauma. The paralysis in the dreams, that's your subconscious recreating the powerlessness you felt." "I know what it is," Katarzyna said, more sharply than intended. "Knowing doesn't make it stop." "No, it doesn't. But understanding gives you power over it. Names things, makes them manageable." Katarzyna wanted to argue but couldn't find the energy. She was so tired, bone-deep exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The other women felt it too. They talked about it during their evening gatherings, the way freedom was somehow more exhausting than captivity had been. In the camp, you only had to survive. Now you had to figure out how to live, which required decisions, choices, and engagement with the future that felt impossible when your past was this heavy. The administrators had started asking about their plans. What did they want to do? Where did they want to go? But how could you plan a future when your present was this fractured? Marta had decided to emigrate to Canada. She had a cousin in Toronto, a nurse who'd left Poland before the war. "I can't go back to Krakow," she'd said. "Everyone there knows me, knows what happened. They'll say I collaborated, that I could have resisted more, that I'm tainted. I'd rather start fresh somewhere no one knows." Sophia was returning to Prague. Her parents were dead, her apartment occupied by someone else. But she had an aunt who'd had said Sophia could stay with her. "I need to be somewhere that speaks my language," Sophia had said. "Even if the people there judge me, at least I'll understand the words they use." Anna was going to Australia. A program was being established specifically for young displaced persons, and she'd signed up without really understanding what Australia was, except that it was far away, impossibly far, far enough that maybe the distance could create something like forgetfulness. Sophia hadn't decided. She sat by the window still, watching the seasons change. Spring becoming summer, summer edging toward autumn. She drew sometimes, not the painful abstracts Sophia created but simple nature sketches. A bird, a flower, a tree bending in wind. The drawings were technically proficient but emotionally flat, like they were made by someone relearning how to see the world without simultaneously seeing horror behind every image. And Katarzyna? She didn't know. Her parents were dead. Her city was under Soviet occupation, being rebuilt according to Stalin's vision. Her profession, teaching, felt impossible. How could she stand in front of students and pretend to care about verb conjugations when the world had revealed itself to be this fundamentally brutal? "Have you considered staying in Germany?" Dr. Bergman asked during one session. Katarzyna stared at her. "Stay in the country that did this to me? Germany needs rebuilding too. Not just physically, morally, ethically. There will be a generation of children who need to understand what their parents did, need to learn a different way. Who better to teach them than people who survived? You want me to educate the children of Nazis? I want you to consider that revenge and justice aren't the same thing. Justice might look like ensuring this never happens again. And that requires education." Katarzyna left that session angry, but the idea stuck like a burr. That night, in the ward where the women still gathered despite having individual rooms now, she mentioned it to the others. "She's insane," Marta said flatly. "Stay in Germany? Teach German children? Why would any of us do that?" But Sophia looked thoughtful. "I understand the logic. If we all leave, if all the survivors scatter, who tells the story? Who makes sure it's remembered correctly?" "The tribunals will do that," Anna said. She'd been following the Nuremberg preparations obsessively. reading every newspaper article about the upcoming trials. They'll punish the guilty. That's justice. Is it? Zofia's voice was quiet but clear. Punishing a few leaders? What about all the others? The officers who weren't important enough to try? The ordinary Germans who looked the other way? The citizens who benefited from our slavery? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. 6 months after liberation, Katarzyna stood in the ruins of Lagernord. It had been demolished, the commandant's building, the factory, the barracks. Everything except the foundation of the building they'd burned. That remained, a concrete scar on the earth, with a temporary wooden sign in 3 languages. Here stood a place of systematic sexual slavery. 1943 to 1945. We remember. A camera crew was there, American journalists documenting the camps for newsreels that would play in cinemas back home. They'd asked Katarzyna to be interviewed, to tell her story for the public record. She'd agreed. Not because she wanted to, but because Dr. Bergman had suggested it might help, might create meaning from suffering, might transform private trauma into public education. The journalist was young, earnest, nervous. "Miss Nowak," he began, and she didn't correct him that it was technically Mrs. Now. A meaningless marriage on paper arranged by relief workers to make immigration easier if she decided to go to America. "Can you describe what this place was?" Katarzyna looked at the foundation, at the concrete that had once supported walls that had contained her degradation. This was a place where the German military enslaved women for sexual purposes. We were treated as resources, as objects, as services to be provided to German personnel. 15 of us were held here. Hundreds more in facilities like this across Germany and occupied territories. How did you survive? By dividing myself. By holding on to a part of me that they couldn't touch no matter what they did to my body. By having other women who understood. By believing, sometimes, that the war would end and we might live to see it. What would you say to the German people? Katarzyna had prepared for this question. Had thought about it during long nights when sleep wouldn't come. I'd say that this didn't happen because a few evil men gave orders. It happened because thousands of ordinary Germans participated or looked away. And I'd say that you have a choice now. You can pretend it didn't happen, can minimize it, can claim you didn't know. Or you can face it. Face what was done in your name. And choose, as a nation, to be different. The journalist looked uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort was appropriate. When the interview ended, when the cameras were packed away, Katarzyna walked to the foundation of the burned building and placed a small stone on the concrete. A Jewish custom she'd learned from Dr. Bergman. A way of saying, I was here. I remember. This happened. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Turned to find Marta, Sophia, Anna, and Zofia approaching. They'd all come, drawn by some unspoken agreement to witness this return together. They stood in silence, 5 women looking at the ruins of their captivity. I'm going to stay, Katarzyna said suddenly. The decision crystallized in her chest, feeling simultaneously right and insane. In Germany, I'm going to teach. I'm going to make sure what happened here doesn't get forgotten or minimized. Marta shook her head. You're braver than I am. Or crazier, Sophia added, but not unkindly. Maybe both, Katarzyna agreed. But someone has to stay. Someone has to be the witness who refuses to leave. Zofia stepped forward, placed her own stone next to Katarzyna's. I'll stay too, she said. I can't run far enough to escape the memories anyway. Might as well stay and make them mean something. This powerful story follows Katarzyna, a survivor of Nazi sexual slavery at Lagernord, as she navigates life after liberation. Beginning with her initial rescue by American forces, we witness her struggle with profound trauma, dissociation, and the painful process of reclaiming her identity. Through the support of Dr. Bergman and fellow survivors, Marta, Zofia, Sophia, and Anna, Katarzyna slowly rebuilds her life. She finds purpose in an unexpected place, teaching German schoolgirls about the Holocaust's atrocities, directly confronting denial and ensuring the truth cannot be buried. The narrative spans 7 years, showing how each survivor carves out meaning from their suffering. Marta finds love in Canada. Sophia returns to dance in Prague. Anna seeks solitude in Australia, and Zofia documents survivor testimonies. Together, they transform from victims into witnesses, refusing to let their trauma be erased or forgotten. This isn't a story of complete healing. The nightmares persist, the scars remain, but of resilient survival with purpose. It's a testament to bearing witness, to confronting uncomfortable truths, and to the stubborn human refusal to let atrocity have the final word. Subscribe to Stories That Must Be Told, where silence is never forgotten and history demands to be heard.